You'll have a hard time finding a more recognizable and iconic Marvel superhero these days than Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. And that is almost entirely due to his role in the MCU as it became the biggest franchise in movie history. So today I thought we'd take a closer look at this character, and now that his journey is seemingly well and truly finished, recap his life and his MCU journey in chronological order. Spoilers for all the Iron Man MCU stuff, obviously. Let's just jump into it. Anthony Edward Stark was born in Manhattan on May 29th, 1970. His father is Howard Stark, a genius millionaire who founded his own weapons manufacturing company, Stark Industries, and who had helped the US in several ways during World War II. However, he's a very cold and distant father to young Tony, and one of the few things Tony recounts that his father talked about was his admiration for Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, a super soldier from World War II who Howard worked with, so throughout his childhood, Tony is not too fond of Steve Rogers. Tony is quite close with his mother Maria though, and Edwin Jarvis, his dad's friend and butler, who helps raise him along with his mom. He also discovers a passion for inventing, with himself also being a genius. Some of his accomplishments: age 4, makes his first circuit board; age 7, a V8 motorbike engine; while he's in high school at Phillips Academy in Massachusetts from age 7 to 14, he hacks into the Pentagon on a dare; and then he gets into MIT early, where he studies engineering. He also wins some awards there for his accomplishments, including for robot design. While at MIT, he also meets James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, and they become BFFs. Tony then graduates, from college mind you, at age 17. So the next few years presumably go pretty damn well for Tony. He's a genius with lots of money, lots of friends, he's a charismatic, snarky, fun guy. I think it's safe to assume he's living a pretty fun life in these years. However, everything changes in December 1991, when Tony's parents leave for vacation and are assassinated by a mind-controlled super soldier working for a Nazi super evil terrorist cult. If you're not familiar with the MCU, that's a pretty sharp handbrake turn, but let's be real here, you all know the story. It's Bucky. But the world, including Tony, is led to believe that the Starks died in a car crash. For a few months, Obadiah Stane, one of Tony's dad's friends and business partners, becomes the interim CEO of Stark Industries, but eventually Tony takes over, which Obadiah isn't too happy about, but we'll get to that. So at age 21, Tony is now the CEO of Stark Industries, and he works in partnership with Stane to make it a hugely successful company. This is helped in part by his BFF Rhodey being in the Air Force and becoming the liaison between Stark Industries and the military, which, in case you can't do the math, weapons manufacturer and military equals a lot of money for Tony Stark. With Tony's genius leading it, Stark Industries quickly starts to make some more advanced weapons, and Tony tinkers in his spare time, making himself an AI that he names after his family's butler, Jarvis, to basically be his version of an Alexa or a Siri, except way more advanced.
Cuttlefish, cuttlefish, cuttlefish.
Tony, who was already a sarcastic, clever guy, becomes a bit more of a dick as success just keeps finding him over and over again, or rather he starts finding it, and he also likes alcohol, and having completely platonic encounters with presumably hundreds of women. Just thought we should flesh out his character at this point a little bit more. On New Year's Eve in 1999, when Tony is 29, he goes to a conference in Switzerland, and at the after party, he gets suitably hammered. He's hanging out with scientist Maya Hansen, and also sometime in the past few years, he's hired a bodyguard with a sweet hairstyle called Happy Hogan. While at the party, a scientist called Ho Yinsen tries to introduce Tony to a guy called Dr. Wu, but Tony's like, I'm drunk, nothing matters, this will never come up again. In a similar vein, another scientist, Aldrich Killian, comes up to Tony asking him to discuss funding this idea he has for a scientific R&D organization known as AIM, and Tony's like, for sure, let's talk about it up on the freezing rooftop. But he ends up not going. Is it just because he forgot? Is it just because he's drunk? Is it because he's a bit of a dick? Probably a bit of all of them. But Tony goes back to his hotel room, talks to Maya about her scientific idea Extremis, which could help grow back human limbs, but unfortunately also makes things explode, and after they spend the night together, Tony leaves her the solution to her exploding Extremis problem that he figured out on the fly, and dips. Aldrich Killian spent the night on the roof. He is not too happy about what Tony's done. We're seeing the beginnings of Tony's dickishness, just making enemies that end up being super powerful, and yeah, he's gonna hold that grudge for a while. But anyway, Tony goes back to his usual CEO stuff. One day, he's confronted in his office by a lower-level Stark employee, Virginia Potts, who noticed an error in some numbers and then got fired for it, and long story short, she tells Tony himself about what she found, and Tony admires the way she does things and hires her as his personal assistant, also giving her the nickname Pepper because she claims she had pepper spray with her when security tried to remove her. They become friends over the next little while, though Tony is a bit of a dick in his Tony ways, forgetting her birthdays and making her get rid of the women he spends the nights with the next morning. You know, that kind of stuff. One day, Tony and Rhodey are out doing a weapons test in Arizona, and Tony's doing his usual playboy partying in prep for a trip to Afghanistan soon to show off a new Stark missile called the Jericho. And Rhodey's like, hey, maybe don't go to Afghanistan. And Tony's like, nah man, it's cool. He also gets attacked by a woman's boyfriend because, of course he does, but Rhodey helps him with that. More cool billionaire douchebag things, not caring about the awards he's receiving, showing up late to his own private jet, all that good stuff. He sleeps with reporter Christine Everhart, then gets on his plane with Rhodey to Afghanistan, where the flight attendants are strippers. Or learn to be strippers, or were all strippers, I can't really remember, honestly. Things soon stop going swimmingly though, as after a successful weapons presentation, the military convoy that Tony is with is attacked by the terrorist group the Ten Rings. Tony gets away for a second, but is soon after in close proximity to an explosion of a Stark Industries missile, which sends lots of shrapnel directly into his chest. He's then kidnapped by the Ten Rings, but kept alive by Ho Yinsen, the scientist he met in Switzerland, who coincidentally has also been kidnapped by the Ten Rings, performing life-saving surgery and putting an electromagnet in his chest that keeps the shrapnel from getting to his heart. Once Tony comes to, the terrorists are demanding he builds them a Jericho missile, which Tony isn't too keen on, which leads to him getting tortured. He also finds out that the Ten Rings somehow have lots of Stark Industries weapons that they've been using, which is obviously not good news, for many reasons. The terrorists like, yeah, we'll let you go if you do this, but that's obviously not true, and Tony and Yinsen start on a new sneaky plan to act like they're building the missile, when really they're building a weaponized suit for Tony to wear to help them escape. The idea is for the suit to be powered by an arc reactor, which is this massive energy source that Tony's dad had built many decades ago with a Russian scientist, Anton Venko. Tony makes a smaller version of the arc reactor, and it's put in his chest in place of the electromagnet. It also helps to keep the shrapnel out of his chest for the time being. Throughout this process, Tony and Yinsen become friends, and Tony learns a little more about humility and life, with them discussing their families, and Tony telling Yinsen he doesn't have any family to return to, with Yinsen replying,
"So you're a man who has everything, and nothing."
And yeah, through this horrible process, you learn to be somewhat less of a dick. Things start to get pretty tense in the cave, so Tony and Yinsen speed up to finish production of the suit, and the time to break out comes. Tony kills a bunch of terrorists in a crazy badass action scene, but Yinsen sacrifices himself to give the suit enough time to initially boot up. With his last words, he tells Tony to not waste his life, something that will stick with Tony for a long time to come. Tony then gets out of there using the jetpack type technology that's installed in the suit, not before causing some more explosions, and crashes in the desert, where he's picked up by Rhodey. Tony comes back to America, meets Pepper, who is happy to see him again, and instead of getting some much-needed medical attention, gets a burger and goes to a press conference. Obadiah Stane is there, and he's like, "Oh, Tony, I'm so happy you're alive. I'm totally not behind all of this." And after Tony saw his weapons used by terrorists, and the lasting impression Yinsen left on him, and the whole experience in general, Tony decides that Stark Industries will no longer make weapons, much to Stane's surprise and unhappiness. Tony wants to work on more arc reactor stuff, which Stane, again, doesn't love, but before anything, Tony has to change out his current arc reactor, since that was mostly just meant to power the suit, so he gets Pepper to change it to a new one he's built, which goes flawlessly? Tony has now gotten the idea that this armored suit thing could have more to it, and so he starts tinkering away, making improvements to his design, making it smaller, more advanced, and especially focusing on flight control using repulsors in his hands and feet, which he discovers can also be used offensively. He eventually learns how to fly, after a few accidents. Obadiah also stops by and tells him that the board has voted Stark out of the company, which Tony isn't happy about, and Stane's like, "Can I see your new work, by the way?" And Tony's like, "Nah." He then keeps working on the suit, implementing Jarvis into it as well, eventually taking it out for a test fly, which is pretty spectacular, until he discovers that if he goes too high up, the suit freezes, which is an issue he then works to fix. Tony also is given his old arc reactor, which Pepper put in a little case with a cute message as a gift to him, which is very sweet and also potentially useful later on. We'll get to that. Tony also finds someone, which he doesn't know to be S.H.I.E.L.D. at the time, the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division, trying to hack into his database. And he's like, "Huh, that's weird. I'll do the reasonable thing you do in this situation. Fly up and destroy their satellite." Simple. Tony then finds out there's a charity event being held under his name that he hasn't even been invited to, so he shows up, partially to show the public that he's A-OK. While there, he says hey to a Watcher informant and is greeted by Agent Phil Coulson of S.H.I.E.L.D., who wants to talk to him about everything that's been happening lately, and Tony's like, yeah, sounds good, goodbye. He then dances with Pepper, and they flirt before almost kissing. Tony then goes to get them a drink, but he's confronted by Christine Everhart, who lets him know that his weapons are being sold to the Ten Rings, which he did not know about. Tony confronts Obadiah Stane about this, who, without actually saying he did it, basically says he did it. He's also like, "By the way, the board voting out of the company, that was actually just me, tee-hee." Tony then leaves, forgetting Pepper's still waiting for him, though at least this time, it won't create a mortal enemy. Tony thinks, screw all this, and takes his newly weaponized and gold hot rod red colored suit to Golmira, specifically to the village that Yinsen was from, and brutally kills all the terrorists there. And he leaves one of his former captors to the people that were being terrorized. He also gets in a bit of a chase with the US military and reveals to Rhodey that it's actually him in that suit. Once he gets back, he asks Pepper to get info from the Stark Industries database on where the other weapons to the 10 rings are being sent. She initially refuses because it would endanger Tony to go on more of these missions, but Tony tells her about what he learned in the cave and his newfound purpose for helping people rather than just making weapons, and it convinces her to do it. Tony is then, however, temporarily paralyzed by this fancy little device from Obadiah Stane, who reveals that it was him who arranged for Tony to be kidnapped and killed because he wanted control back of Stark Industries. He also now has his own weaponized suit of armor that was able to be conceived of and put together thanks to the pieces that Tony left behind in the desert, and also he's gonna kill Pepper. He then takes the arc reactor in Tony's chest and leaves him to die, but thanks to his robotic arm buddy Dummy, Tony is able to get the old arc reactor that Pepper gave him, and that saves his life. He suits up and goes to save Pepper, who also got Phil Coulson to work with her to take down Stane. A big armored suit on armored suit battle ensues, lots of repulsor blasts and punches and explosions. However, Stark briefly gets the upper hand when Stane's suit does not have the tech to deal with freezing in high altitudes, ending up with them on the Stark Industries rooftop. Tony's arc reactor is the old, not great one though, so he doesn't have a ton of juice left either. He creates a plan to have Pepper fire up the giant Stark Industries arc reactor beneath them to kill Stane, which eventually happens, and Tony barely makes it out alive. After the battle, Coulson again tries to talk to Tony, telling him that with SHIELD training, he can be a real badass and make proper use of his suit. The next day at a press conference, Coulson gives Tony a detailed made-up story that involves the superhero alter ego, which the press has called Iron Man, being a bodyguard of his. However, Tony's not really about that, and he tells the world,
I am Iron Man.
Later on, Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., shows up in Tony's house to tell him that he isn't the only superhero in the world, and he wants to talk to Tony about the Avengers Initiative, a team of superheroes. These S.H.I.E.L.D. people do not leave Tony alone. Tony's like, please leave. Tony then starts using his newfound superhero life to try to create world peace, going on some armored adventures, if you will, which leads to him being Time's Person of the Year. These adventures include lots of fighting and defeating 10 Rings members, though he also saves a crashed pilot in the Democratic Republic of Congo and recovers some stolen art in Germany. But anyway, being Iron Man comes at a cost, and Tony's arc reactor is currently poisoning him. At the moment, there isn't a way to make an arc reactor that can power the suits, but also not poison Tony. And also, on top of this, the US government, specifically Gary Shandling, see a weapon of horrible destruction and say, mine. Tony, however, distracts himself with booze and dancing girls and fame, starting up the Stark Expo again, a showcase of inventions and innovations and weapons that his father had held several times. Anyway, Shandling, aka Stern, aka a secret Hydra agent, don't worry about it, worry about it a little bit, but not right now, says, give us the Iron Man tech, and Tony says, you can kiss my ass. If other countries and companies were able to get access to his tech, they could use it against America and for lots of bad stuff. Justin Hammer, one of Tony's rivals in the weaponry and tech world, is also present, also against Tony, and Tony shows off that Hammer and others have been trying to make Iron Man-like suits, but they've failed miserably. However, Tony, with all of the stresses of his life currently, is back to being not just fun, arrogant Tony, but dickish arrogant Tony. He also hasn't been taking much care of Stark Industries since he's busy being Iron Man, so he's like, hey Pepper, you're CEO now. Cool, I'm such a good person. Pepper then gets a new notary, Natalie Rushman, who prompts Tony to think he also needs a notary.
I want one.
No.
Tony, essentially at this point, believes he doesn't have that long to live because of the poisoning, so he gets more impulsive, if you can believe that. And as a result, while at the Monaco Grand Prix, he steps in to race in it himself. However, his fun is cut short by a guy with electric whips and his very own arc reactor, awkward, stepping onto the track and trying to murder Tony. Luckily, Tony has a briefcase suit with him that Happy gets to him, so he's able to beat up the whip guy. Some might call him Whiplash, by some, no one in the actual film. But Tony's like, that's kinda weird. No one's supposed to have this tech. Tony talks to the guy in prison, who turns out to be Ivan Vanko, son of Anton Vanko, the Russian scientist who Tony's dad made the original arc reactor with. Anton had wanted to use it for profit, so Howard had him deported to the USSR, where he was exiled to Siberia and didn't live a great life. So now his son Ivan is out for revenge. Tony leaves him in jail, from where he may or may not soon escape, and the Senate has much better ground to stand on in terms of demanding Tony hand over the tech, now that clearly someone else also has it. Rhodey talks to Tony about the military wanting his tech, and finds out about the poisoning, which Tony otherwise has kept to himself. And Rhodey tells him he doesn't have to do this whole lone gunslinger act, but Tony promises him it's all good. Tony now seemingly has a week to live, and after Natalie flirts with him a bit, he decides he's still gonna go through with a birthday party he had planned, and gets absolutely hammered. He uses the Iron Man suit for not its intended purposes, let's say. Although some of them are intended, I suppose.
You just keep the suit.
I know, it has a filtration system. You could drink that water.
Much to the horror and annoyance of Rhodey and Pepper. Rhodey has eventually had enough and puts on the Mark II suit to subdue Tony, and he and Tony end up duking it out throughout Tony's mansion. It's a pretty even fight, given that one is a novice who's sober, and one is an expert who's plastered. Eventually, they both fire their repulsor blasts at each other at the same time, which causes a massive explosion. Rhodey flies off to give the suit to the military, and Tony goes off and does the obvious thing to do when you're gonna die soon: get donuts. Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up again, and after revealing that Natalie is actually S.H.I.E.L.D. spy Natasha Romanoff, who was sent to keep an eye on him, he basically tells Tony, get up, get your ass into gear, and fix his poisoning problem. It's possible, after injecting him with some chemical to slow down the poisoning. Tony's given some of his dad's stuff to look through while Phil Coulson keeps an eye on him, and he finds out that his father was one of the founders of S.H.I.E.L.D. He finds a video of his father actually saying he's proud of him, and that Tony is his greatest creation. Pretty emotional stuff for Tony. He then goes to try and apologize to Pepper. It doesn't really work out, because he still acts like a bit of an asshole while doing it. But while there, he finds his dad's old model for the Stark Expo, and in that model, he discovers the formula for a new element that his father discovered while researching the Tesseract, but couldn't synthesize with his technology at the time, so he left it for his son to discover in the future, secretly hidden in a model of the Expo that he happened to spot while leaving Pepper's office, exactly when he needed it. Yeah. This part of the plot is a little thin, but just go with it. Tony has now finally gotten his mojo back, and after a construction-destruction montage, with the very brief help of Coulson, he manages to synthesize this new element, put it in his chest, and boom, poisoning solved. However, there isn't too much time to celebrate, as Tony gets a call from Vanko, who has escaped from prison and has worked with Justin Hammer to make a bunch of drones and a new Iron Man suit with the tech that Rhodey brought the military and Hammer, all of which is soon to be presented at the Stark Expo, with Rhodey inside the new suit. Tony suits up in what is now the Mark VI new and improved suit, with his new and improved arc reactor, and heads over to the expo. Once he gets there, Vanko takes over all the drones and the Rhodey suit, and sends them all after Tony, who manages to evade them using his superior mobility and intelligence, saving a young kid called Peter Parker along the way. Natasha Romanoff hacks through Rhodey's suit and gives him back control after a bit of a chase, and now Tony and Rhodey team up in their suits to take out, I believe the technical term is, an ass ton of drones. They successfully do so, it's a great action scene, but then Vanko shows up in a new and improved? Iron Man suit of his own with his signature whips. Tony and Rhodey fight him for a while before using their repulsor blast explosion trick they learned earlier to mortally wound Vanko, who, before his death, sets all the drones to self-destruct. Tony saves Pepper from all the explosions, they have a freaked out argument conversation, which ends in Tony telling her how much he cares about her, and they kiss. Hammer is arrested, and Fury talks to Tony, telling him that based on everything they've seen, he's not suited for the Avengers, but they want to have him work for S.H.I.E.L.D. as a consultant, which Tony agrees to so he can have Stern present him with a medal as one last screw you in typical Tony style. Tony does his job as a consultant by going to talk to General Thaddeus Ross, who recently came off a bit of a disaster in trying to track down this super powerful being called the Hulk. More on him later, during which he created his own super powerful being known as the Abomination, who he now has been told by the World Security Council, a group of powerful people who oversee S.H.I.E.L.D., who also may be partially Hydra, to put on the Avengers team. S.H.I.E.L.D. is like, yeah, the Abomination seems like bad news, we don't want that to happen. I mean, come on, his name is literally the Abomination. We do not want him on the Avengers. So Tony does what Tony does best, and irritates General Ross so much that he refuses to hand over the Abomination to be on the Avengers. Tony is now living a relatively more humble life, relatively being the operative word here. He starts working on building Stark Tower in New York, run entirely on clean energy. He also takes Rhodey's suit back and makes him a new one, so he now too can be a super advanced suit-having superhero. War Machine. He's also now officially dating Pepper. Very sweet. Stark Tower finally lights up, and Tony and Pepper are celebrating when Phil Coulson shows up again. And it's like, hey, I know we told you we didn't want you for the Avengers, but now we need you, because an angry space god has showed up and stolen the Tesseract, that super powerful object, aka Infinity Stone, that Tony's dad did experiments on. Tony does a bit of research on this Avengers team and the Tesseract and all of this various stuff, and he's like, fine, I guess I'll do this, and flies over to Germany where he finds some of the Avengers have already been assembled, including Natasha and his dad's old friend from the 40s, Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, who was recently unfrozen from the Arctic where he had been for 70 years. Long story. Anyway, Steve's getting his ass handed to him by Loki, so Tony just blasts Loki, and he is taken captive. Tony, who doesn't play well with others at the best of times, and remember, doesn't have a particular fondness for Cap, given how much his father, who didn't show Tony much affection, talked about him growing up, automatically doesn't get off to a great start with Steve. They have some back and forth until Loki's space god brother Thor shows up to take Loki back to their space god home of Asgard. Tony's not crazy about this idea, and so tackles Thor, and they fight after having some more back and forth.
Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?
In their fight, Thor tries to electrocute Tony with his hammer, but since Vanko sent electricity through his suit, Tony has updated it to use that electricity to power itself. So he gets a boost and this nice moment in the fight. It's ultimately ended by Cap showing up, who then has a moment with Thor, but eventually they realize they're on the same team, and Thor comes with them to take Loki back to S.H.I.E.L.D. HQ, which is a giant floating fortress known as the Helicarrier. Anyway, he meets Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk, and they get along really well, both being science bros. And Tony also decides to hack into S.H.I.E.L.D. systems to find out their secrets. Because why not? While Tony and Banner have a pretty nice conversation comparing the burden of the Hulk to Tony's kidnapping in the arc reactor, Tony and Steve still aren't getting along. They're pretty opposite personalities clashing, although Tony does plant a seed in his head that S.H.I.E.L.D. could be up to more than they're letting on, being a super secret spy and intelligence organization and all. Tony, through his hacking, soon discovers that S.H.I.E.L.D. was planning on making weapons of mass destruction using the Tesseract, after Thor came to Earth a few years ago so they could fight off other alien threats, which Cap then confirmed after having found some of Hydra's old tech from World War II. Hydra also used the Tesseract to make weapons, just to be clear. Nick Fury is confronted with all this, and all the Avengers start getting into a bit of an argument, including Tony and Steve in particular, who talk about which one of them is a real hero, and almost start physically fighting before Bruce picks up Loki's scepter inadvertently, hinting that maybe Loki and the scepter are having a bit of a bad influence on the already somewhat fragile stability of this team. Loki's big master plan then kicks off as his crew, led by a brainwashed Clint Barton aka Hawkeye, soon to be Avenger, breaks into the Helicarrier to bust Loki out, leading to damage to the propeller and the Helicarrier starting to fall. Tony and Steve put aside their differences and work together to make sure the entire ship doesn't come crashing down, but when that's done they find out that Banner hulked out and left, and Thor was dropped from the sky by Loki, who also escaped. And Phil Coulson was murdered by Loki, which in essence gives these heroes a personal stake and something to finally avenge. Also on the plus side, they got Hawkeye back. Yay. Tony and Steve are discussing Coulson's death and Loki's plan when Tony realizes Loki is going to use Stark Tower to power up the Tesseract, which, by the way, will open a portal and send an alien army to Earth. So with this, the remaining Avengers suit up and head to New York, where Tony finds Loki at Stark Tower exactly as expected. They engage in a battle of wits, one of Tony's strong suits, with Tony eventually delivering this iconic line.
Because if we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn well sure we'll avenge it.
Loki has had enough of it and throws Tony out of the window, or rather, through the window, who, thanks to these neat little bracelets, is able to call a suit to stop himself from splattering. He flies back up and blasts Loki, but then the portal opens and the Chitauri alien army at Loki's command starts to come through, and the Battle of New York is on. Tony is fighting aliens in his suit and calls Rhodey to come help, but Rhodey says he's busy fighting Ten Rings terrorists and he'll come ASAP, because that mission is definitely more important than the literal alien army Armageddon. James. Anyway, the battle continues and Thor and Banner show back up again, and the Avengers are now truly assembled. Cap gives out instructions, Tony's job is to secure the perimeter and make sure the aliens don't leave New York, and lots of crazy battle ensues, including team-ups like Tony shooting his repulsor off of Cap's shield, and also moments like Tony going through a Chitauri Leviathan and blowing it up from the inside. The battle's going pretty well, as Natasha has found a way to close the portal using Loki's scepter, but the World Security Council has decided to send a nuke to blow up Manhattan to stop the aliens, despite the loss of human life that would accompany that. So Tony tells Nat to keep the portal open, he grabs the nuke, flies it out into space, and launches it towards the Chitauri mothership, blowing it up and thus killing all the Chitauri. On the way, he tries to call Pepper, as he imagines he might not make it back. It's a pretty surreal experience for Tony, seeing space and losing consciousness up there, thinking he's gonna die. He falls back down to Earth, is caught by the Hulk, and survives. And although he's joking around in usual Tony fashion afterwards, yeah, that's an experience that'll mess him up for a bit. Potentially for most of the rest of his life. But for the time being, Tony wants shawarma to celebrate their victory, but first the Avengers gotta go take care of the defeated Loki. Back in Stark Tower, as they're taking Loki away, Hulk is forced to take the stairs because Tony's elevator has a weight capacity, sadness for Hulk, and as they're leaving, Tony and the gang are confronted by Alexander Pierce of the World Security Council, who definitely isn't a secret Nazi, who's like, hey, give us Loki and the Tesseract, and both Tony and Thor are like, hell no. So there's a bit of a scuffle, but ultimately they keep both the Tesseract and Loki, which are to be sent off to Asgard with Thor. Before this though, the Avengers do get their shawarma, with Loki, I guess, just chained up outside. And at this time, Rhodey finally arrives. Way too late to actually be of any help. Way to go, James. Anyway, the Avengers meet in Central Park to say goodbye, with a nice respect now built between the team, including between Tony and Steve, who shake hands and are now kind of friends. Thor heads off with Loki and the Tesseract, and they all go their separate ways, though they're now a team, who are realistically gonna end up assembled at least a few more times. Tony goes home and starts working on rebuilding Stark Tower, which is pretty messed up after the battle, which he starts to turn into Avengers Tower. He and Pepper move out to stay at his Malibu mansion in the meantime, and he also creates Damage Control, a project to clean up New York after the Chitauri invasion, and to clean up in general after other future Avengers superhero stuff, which I'm sure doesn't piss anyone off and creates no villains whatsoever. Quick reminder here that if you're enjoying this video, drop a like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Tony Stark down below. Tony Stark's journey. Is he your favorite Avenger? Also, after this video, check out my podcast, The Poorly Planned Podcast. Alright, back to the video. However, Tony is pretty messed up from his near-death experience in space facing a Chitauri mothership. He has frequent anxiety attacks now, and as a result, he sleeps less and spends his time building more and more Iron Man suits, leading to the Iron Legion, including now one that can be called to him in individual pieces. There's also a terrorist leader of the Ten Rings known as the Mandarin, who's taking credit for multiple bombings, who Tony has his eye on as someone to take out. But Rhodey's like, hey, relax, let the government take care of this one. Rhodey now also has a new rebrand, going from War Machine to the Iron Patriot, as requested by President Ellis. Anyway, Tony's also made Happy his head of security, and he lets Tony know that Pepper's meeting with Aldrich Killian, that guy who he didn't meet up with back in 1999, who's now all sexy Guy Pearce CEO guy. Guy. Didn't even try to do that. Anyway, Happy follows him and his bodyguard because they're giving off kind of weird vibes, and meanwhile, Tony's having a bit of friction with Pepper due to his suit-building obsession. Also, maybe slightly due to this giant bunny Christmas gift. But he talks to her more openly about his anxiety problems, with him just being a dude in a world with giant alien invasions, and his worries about Pepper somehow getting hurt, which leads to Pepper comforting him and being very understanding. However, there's still problems, cause with his new suit technology, he accidentally calls a suit to himself in his sleep as he's having nightmares, which Pepper is understandably pretty scared by. Things go from bad to worse as Happy, while trailing Killian's bodyguard, is severely wounded in another Mandarin bombing, and Tony's now in a pretty bad state of mind and very angry, so he calls out the Mandarin, calling him a coward and giving him his home address so they can throw down properly. Great idea. Pepper is reasonably like, what the f***? And starts trying to pack up so they can leave, while Tony does some hologram detective work with the bombing scene and discovers a clue that leads to Rose Hill, Tennessee. All this is interrupted by Maya Hansen, that scientist from 99 who was working on Extremis, who shows up to tell Tony she needs to talk to him about the Mandarin. However, just then, the mansion is attacked by the Mandarin's forces, because of course it is, and while Pepper and Maya get out okay, with Pepper briefly having the Mark 42 suit on, Tony engages in a bit of a battle that he ultimately loses and barely escapes from, with the world now thinking he's dead. He passes out in the suit and wakes up to find Jarvis's flight plan took him to Rose Hill, Tennessee, after which the Mark 42, which is just a prototype really, shuts down, and Tony has to make his way through this with no suit. He breaks into a garage and is confronted by Harley Keener, a kid with a potato gun, but they end up getting along pretty well, and Tony gets him to let him use his garage to hide out and help him in his Mandarin hunting quest. The two of them bond and also figure out some more clues on what this whole Mandarin bombing thing is about, with Tony having another anxiety attack along the way, and eventually they find Mrs. Davis, mother of a man who supposedly was part of a suicide bombing in Rose Hill, which Tony thinks is linked to the Mandarin bombings. Mrs. Davis gives Tony a file about this, but realizes he's not who she's actually been waiting for, which turns out to be this woman, who is working with Aldrich Killian's bodyguard, who's also there. Starting to seem a bit like Aldrich Killian might be connected to all of this stuff. Turns out these people have powers, most of which seem to be fire-based. They can walk through fire, they can also regenerate limbs, have super strength, can make stuff hot, and a big action scene ensues in which Tony uses some of his quick wit and genius to kill this woman, and then with the help of Harley and this device that he gave him to handle bullies, bit extreme, temporarily defeat this guy. Tony gets out of Rose Hill and gets in touch with Rhodey, and along with an encounter with the superfan, is able to find out some more info about what's going on. With it turning out AIM, Aldrich Killian's company, has been injecting people with Extremis, which regrows limbs, gives super strength, and all that stuff, but can also lead to them blowing up in some cases. Not great, which would explain the Mandarin bombings and their peculiar nature with the lack of bomb shelling being found. Tony then gets on his way to find the Mandarin, who he's found out is in Miami, but has another panic attack while getting there. Harley talks to him about, why don't you just build some stuff if you don't have your suits? Use your smarts. And this calms Tony down quite a bit and virtually cures his panic attacks. He then gets a bunch of supplies and builds some makeshift weapons, breaks into the Mandarin's complex, only to of course discover that it is
Trevor Slattery.
Yes, the feared terrorist, the Mandarin, is actually a British actor who is a bit of a fool, shall we say? It turns out that the one actually behind all of this was Aldrich Killian. Surprise. And the Mandarin was just a front. And then Tony's knocked unconscious and taken prisoner by Killian. When he wakes up, he's confronted by Killian and also discovers that Maya Hansen has been working with him, and Killian wants Tony to finally fix the Extremis problem of the people blowing up once and for all. And as a little incentive, he injects Pepper with Extremis, so Tony kind of has to find a solution. Maya Hansen at this point is like, you know what, this is a bit much for me. She threatens to kill herself, and Killian's like, okay. He then leaves Tony with some henchmen, who Tony is able to defeat eventually.
You're gonna be in a puddle of blood on the ground in 5, 4, 3, come on!
Once his armor is charged up and released from Tennessee. He has a bit of an action scene with only some pieces of the armor, and then runs into Rhodey, who is not in the Iron Patriot suit he just saw jet off. Turns out that's one of Killian's henchmen in the suit going to kidnap the president on Air Force One, and so Tony remotely controls the Mark 42 suit to go and stop that. Unfortunately, the henchman manages to get the president into the Patriot suit, which then flies off, and he has a fight with Tony, which ends poorly for him. However, he had already planted a bomb, and so the plane is blown wide open with everyone on board being flung out. Tony uses his smarts to figure out a plan in a split second and catches all the falling people by getting them to join together with their hands as they fall, eventually dumping them safely in a river. Tony and Rhodey locate Killian's position, and now that what's left of his mansion has been cleared up, Tony now has access to his entire Iron Legion, which he calls to help in this big final confrontation. Killian is planning on killing the president on live TV, because he also has a deal with the vice president, long story short. So Rhodey goes off to save the president, while Tony goes off to save Pepper, and the Iron Legion takes on all these extremist soldiers. Extremists or extremists? I've forgotten how they say it, and now maybe I've been mispronouncing it this whole time. Also, apparently the armors are only able to be worn by Tony because they're coded to him? Sure. Rhodey manages to save the president, Tony finds Pepper and is trying to save her, but Killian shows up and starts using his fancy fire powers to try and kill Tony. As the whole thing falls into chaos, Tony almost manages to save Pepper, but whoops, she falls into a fiery pit of death and doom. Now it's time for Tony to face off with Killian again, in a crazy fight that involves Tony getting in and then promptly getting out of various suits, as Killian is able to pretty much cut through them like tinfoil. Eventually, Tony gets the Mark 42 armor to the scene, and after correcting Killian for saying Pepper was almost perfect, he traps him in the Mark 42 and blows it up, escaping with lots of grace in the process. However, lots of twists incoming. Killian survived because of his extremist powers, but Pepper also survived because of her extremist powers, and she actually kills Killian, along with taking out one of Tony's suits that's targeting her because of the extremists. She then goes,
Did I do that?
and Tony's like, yes, you did. They embrace, and as a sign that he's moving on from his Iron Man obsession and is ready to be a better boyfriend, Tony blows up all of his Iron Man suits, and it's a nice little firework display for him and Pepper. Tony, because he's rich, finds a way to have the extremist taken out of Pepper, and while he's at it, he thinks it's about time to get that shrapnel taken out of his chest, leaving no more need for an arc reactor. He throws the arc reactor in the ocean, but even without the armor,
I am Iron Man.
and as you'll soon see, he'll continue to be Iron Man with the armor anyway. But for the time being, he and Pepper move into Avengers Tower. After all this stress, Tony could use some therapy, actually a lot of therapy, but instead of getting an actual therapist, he calls Bruce Banner, who promptly falls asleep listening to all of these stories. Needless to say, Bruce Banner would be bored out of his mind by this video. Anyway, Tony is kind of done being a superhero, though he still helps S.H.I.E.L.D. out here and there, like he helps them design repulsors for some new helicarriers of theirs, and presumably other work like that. He also notices when S.H.I.E.L.D. is actually revealed to have been filled with Hydra agents for several decades, in case I didn't mention a Nazi supervillain cult from World War II, and so S.H.I.E.L.D. is pretty wrecked for the time being. Tony was actually a target of Hydra's plan to shoot lots of people with helicarriers, but luckily Cap stopped that from happening. With all this going on, the Avengers are like, we should probably get back together to stop this Nazi cult. And that, coupled with the fact that although Tony doesn't have extreme panic attacks anymore, he's still a bit haunted by the idea of an otherworldly threat coming to conquer or destroy Earth, Tony takes the excuse to start building lots of Iron Man suits again, suit up, and start being a superhero again. Pepper is not too crazy about this. The Avengers reassemble to take out some Hydra people in Sudan, before eventually finding the Hydra base in the Eastern European country of Sokovia, which they successfully attack. Tony finds a secret door, and behind it finds a giant Leviathan from the Battle of New York, and Loki's scepter, the latter of which being what they were after. And just at that moment, he's enchanted by a superpowered witch mutant being, it's kind of unclear at this point, named Wanda Maximoff, who, along with her brother Pietro, have been working for Hydra. And she gives him a vision of all the Avengers dead and aliens invading Earth, and for Tony, who just barely was getting over his alien nightmares, this is pretty distressing. He takes the scepter, and the Avengers head back to HQ. The plan was for Thor to take the scepter to Asgard, but Tony's like, let me actually take a look at this thing now. He confides in Banner that he wants to build an AI called Ultron, which can then use Iron Legion-like suits to keep the world safe, thus allowing the Avengers to retire without having to worry about alien invasions. And the Mind Stone, which is inside the scepter, could be the key to creating this AI. Banner's initially a little skeptical, but then he's like, what's the worst that could happen? They work on this for a few days, but it looks pretty hopeless, so they give up and go out to party. And by go out, I mean stay in Tony's giant tower. It's a fun old time, with Rhodey somewhat embarrassing himself, Tony and Thor comparing girlfriends, Cap's new BFF Sam Wilson is there, and eventually, as the party starts winding down, the Avengers take turns trying to lift Thor's hammer, which you can only lift if you are worthy of the powers of Thor, which Tony is not. It's all a great time until a messed up Iron Legion suit that sounds like the Lizard King bursts in, revealing that he is in fact Ultron. He's gained sentience and intelligence, and he's here to destroy the Avengers. Not great news, but the Avengers are able to defeat the Iron Legion suits that come at them. However, Ultron digitally escapes, and the Avengers are left wondering what to do now. Tony discovers that Ultron found the Avengers files and learned about humanity, killed Jarvis, and he's now gone to make himself a new body. The Avengers aren't super psyched about this, especially Thor, who's like, you shouldn't have messed with that Mind Stone, Tony. Oh yeah, Ultron also stole the scepter, just by the way. Tony starts laughing, a bit like a crazy person. And Cap gives a little mini speech about fighting together and potentially losing together. Eventually, they get it together and locate Ultron, who has also recruited the Maximoff twins. They realize he's going to meet with Ulysses Claw, a South African arms dealer and generally bad dude who stole some vibranium, what Cap's shield is made of, from the country of Wakanda. Ultron probably wants vibranium for his new body. Let's go find Claw. They head off to South Africa to find Ultron already there, who Tony starts fighting with after a brief exchanging of wits, but after he defeats this Ultron body, he realizes Wanda has messed with the minds of all the Avengers, almost all, including Banners, who's now going full Hulk Rampage mode in Johannesburg. Tony dons the newly made Hulkbuster armor to try and subdue the Hulk, which takes quite a while and includes lots of face punches and leads to a lot of destruction, but eventually he hits him with an absolutely devastating cross that knocks the Hulk out, ending the carnage.
Right clock is brought to you by Modelo.
The team, for lack of better words, have gotten their asses absolutely handed to them, so they retreat to Hawkeye's farm, because Hawkeye has a secret family that Nick Fury helped him hide on a farm, basically. They regroup there. Tony and Steve are doing manly man stuff like chopping wood when they start arguing about maybe it wasn't a great idea to make an AI, but before they can really get into it, Tony has to go meet Nick Fury, who tells him, hey, all that alien stuff was just a trick by Wanda, get your head in the game. And Tony responds, I still think that stuff could happen. Fury gives the team a motivational speech, Thor goes off to learn about Infinity Stones, Cap and the team go off to Seoul, where they've deduced Ultron is trying to create the ultimate body for himself, and Tony goes off to Oslo to find out what has been stopping Ultron from accessing the nuclear codes, which it turns out has been Jarvis, who didn't die but hid in the internet, foiling Ultron's schemes, like getting the nuclear codes. With this info, Tony gets back to Avengers Tower, where he finds the Avengers have gotten the ultimate body of Ultron, and he's like, hey Bruce, remember when we made that robot that's now gonna destroy the world? Let's do that again. And after about 10 seconds, Bruce is like, yeah, right. Steve's not too happy about this idea, understandably. Tony isn't too happy about him having recruited the Maximoffs. A bit of a fight breaks out, but then Thor shows up and zaps the body which Jarvis was being uploaded into and has the Mind Stone in its head, and boom, Vision is created. And luckily, he's good and on the Avengers side. With this new ally, the Avengers head to Sokovia to stop Ultron, who's gonna pick up a big piece of the capital city, dump it on the Earth like a meteor, which will destroy all life, because that will bring peace, I guess. Robots, man. I don't even know. The Avengers show up and start evacuating the city, with Nick Fury and Rhodey showing up as well to help, while the Avengers battle Ultron's minions and also try to save as many people as they can. Tony realizes they've got to destroy the city once it's evacuated so it doesn't crash down into Earth, and in the meantime they have to defend this thing from the Ultron bots that will send the city crashing down. It's an intense battle, but the Avengers do come out on top. Ultron is defeated, Tony and Thor manage to blow up the city, and the day is saved. Except Pietro died, just by the way. Although Tony didn't have much time to get to know that guy. Neither did the audience, actually. Hulk also goes off to no one actually knows where. Anyway, after this, Tony thinks we need a new Avengers base, so I'll turn one of my dad's warehouses that hasn't been used for a while into said new base. He then decides to retire from Avengering, again, seems to be a bit of a common theme here of retiring and unretiring, and he goes to say goodbye to his fellow teammates, including a nice little convo with Steve about retirement and building houses in the woods. Pepper has not been a fan of all of this Iron Manning though, and so her and Tony break up for the time being. Now, as we all do after a breakup, Tony is presumably aimlessly browsing through YouTube one day when he discovers a superhero in New York known as Spider-Man, who has some pretty impressive abilities. He's strong, agile, he's got cool stuff going on. Webs and sticking to stuff and all that. Tony looks into it and finds out he's actually a 14-year-old in Queens, and he also finds out that he's pretty smart. Being super rich and having some time on his hands, Tony designs a new upgraded supersuit for this kid in case he ever wants him to join the Avengers, which he might before too long. Anyway, Tony is now just kind of floating around doing rich person stuff. One of his employees, Quentin Beck, makes this hologram tech that helps you relive memories and process them and all that. Tony calls it BARF, gives a talk at MIT, gives the kids some money for science. Good stuff. I mean, the barf thing might get on someone's nerves, I'm not really sure. However, he is approached by the mother of someone who died during the Sokovia battle, and she's like, this is your fault. You and the Avengers kill a lot of people when you're saving the world. Shame. Which gets Tony thinking, who's already feeling a bit guilty about all that damage that pretty much was entirely his fault, if you think about it. A little while later, Wanda, who's now on the Avengers team, is involved in another incident that while saving the day, a bunch of innocent people were killed, and so General Ross from earlier shows up and he's like, here are the Sokovia Accords, because you guys kill a lot of people and cause a lot of damage when saving the world. This will let the government have control of where you guys go and what you do as a team. Tony thinks, brilliant, a way to stop killing so many people while saving the world. We need accountability, we need to be put in check. This will help everyone. Plus, signing it could help win Pepper back by showing her I'm a changed man and this whole Avengering thing isn't just some crazy, dangerous endeavor I undertake, but part of a government program. pretty much half the Avengers agree, while the other half totally don't, including Steve, who's like, I don't want the government telling me I can't save a cat from a tree. And so a disagreement is born. A civil war, perhaps you could call it. Although actually it's mostly just a disagreement, with a bit of punching involved. Anyway, Steve goes off to attend the funeral of his girlfriend from the 1940s, Peggy, and there's a gathering in Vienna of world leaders to sign the accords and make them official. It is blown up by what Tony and the world is led to believe is the Winter Soldier, Steve's friend from World War II, who was brainwashed by Hydra but now is allegedly unbrainwashed, who is then arrested, and Tony goes to help with cleaning the whole situation up. He asks Vision to keep Wanda in the Avengers complex to keep her out of trouble. He also finds out that Cap and Sam were trying to help the Winter Soldier, aka Bucky, and he sits down with Steve to talk about the Accords again. They actually start to get somewhere, talking about some more personal stuff like Pepper, Bucky. Steve starts to consider it, but when the topic of Wanda comes up and her essentially being locked in the Avengers complex comes up, they start arguing again, and Steve leaves. After this, Bucky escapes and starts going on a Winter Soldier rampage, which Tony is able to briefly slow, but he's ultimately thrown to the side, and even facing the likes of Natasha and T'Challa, the Wakandan prince who also is the superhero Black Panther, Bucky is able to escape. After this, Tony notices that, coincidence, Steve and Sam are gone too. Ross is like, I'm gonna go send my guys to kill them, because sending soldiers to take care of superheroes always works out, and Tony's like, wait, give me a little bit of time to bring them in myself. He puts together a team of sorts with Natasha, Rhodey, Vision, Black Panther, and he thinks, you know what, we could use some extra reinforcements, like a super strong spider-powered 14-year-old, because it totally makes sense to bring a kid into battle. Granted, it should be a relatively friendly battle, but still, I don't know about this one, Tony. He goes to basically conduct a job interview with Peter, also flirting with his aunt along the way, and reveals to Peter that he knows who he is, and that he could be an asset to the Avengers. Tony also finds that he and Peter share some of the same moral beliefs about the responsibility of being a hero, so Spider-Boy
Spider-Man
is now on the team. Tony tells Happy to get the kid the suit he designed for him and get him to Germany. Why Germany? Well, there's an airport there that Captain America and his team of super friends is planning on escaping from, as they were already in Germany in the previous part of the film. So Tony has the airport evacuated and stops Steve in his tracks. Tony's like, hand over Bucky and turn yourself in. Steve starts going on about some nonsense about this guy, Zemo, who actually caused the bombing and who's manipulating them and planning on releasing lots of Winter Soldiers. Blah blah blah, too many words. Tony isn't here for it. If he can't make Steve come willingly, he'll force the cooperation, at which point Spider-Man is sent in, after which Ant-Man and Hawkeye come in, and now it's a fight. Tony goes after Wanda and Hawkeye, but that doesn't go so well. The Captain America team is not being subdued, quite the opposite, so Tony calls in the big gun, Vision, to help out as well. Steve's team still won't stand down, so it's time for an epic running at each other moment. Tony gets knocked back by one of Hawkeye's arrows, and then more arrows come at him. God, Hawkeye was really going for Tony in this battle. And through this, Ant-Man ends up in Tony's armor, a shrinky superhero, long story short. Tony manages to get rid of him, but because the tide was turning in favor of Tony's team, Ant-Man turns himself into Giant Man. After a little tussle with Falcon, Tony, Rhodey, and Peter work together to take down Giant Man, ultimately getting their strategy from Peter's suggestion about the Empire Strikes Back, and it's super effective. Peter hits the ground hard, and Tony's like, oh man, did I really just get this 14-year-old killed within minutes of his first real mission? But luckily Peter's okay. But it's time for him to go home. Tony and Rhodey fly after Cap and Bucky, who are in a Quinjet, with Falcon hot on their tail. Tony's like, get rid of Falcon for me, Vision. Vision tries, but accidentally shoots down Rhodey instead, and in a super high-tech suit that unfortunately does not have a parachute, Rhodey crashes into the ground with Tony just barely missing him. This leaves Tony understandably not too happy. Luckily, Rhodes is not dead, but he is paralyzed from the waist down, and Tony's like, Vision, what the hell? And Vision's like, I don't even know. Tony then talks to Natasha, who actually helped Cap get away. Thanks for double-crossing me, Natasha. And then goes to talk with the now captured Team Cap. However, on the way there, he does find out that, whoops, Cap was actually right. It was this guy, Zemo, Bucky was framed, and Tony was wrong. I hate it when that happens. So at the prison, after getting roasted and handing out roasts,
Hank Pym always said you never can trust a Stark. Who are you? Come on, man.
He talks to Falcon about where Cap is going, now that he knows he was wrong, and Cap could use all the help he can get. Falcon tells him Siberia, and so that's where Tony heads, where he finds Cap and Bucky, and they manage to make a truce. They find all the extra Winter Soldiers dead, and Zemo there, who reveals he's from Sokovia, and his family died in the Ultron attack there, which he blames the Avengers for. And he's now gonna tear them apart as revenge. He then shows Tony video footage of the Winter Soldier murdering his parents, which is pretty upsetting, obviously, and Tony then discovers that Cap knew about this for a while, and decided not to share that information with him. Yes, Bucky was brainwashed by Hydra, but when it comes to literally murdering your parents, when the guy who did that is standing next to you, it starts to get hard to remember that. And yeah, for those who think Tony's blind rage moment here is unrealistic, let's just be clear that he's a stressed out superhero with severe anxiety regarding aliens invading Earth, who is already guilty for all the destruction he's caused. He's broken up with the love of his life. He spent the last few days arguing and fighting with Cap and his team, and now has discovered that the man who murdered his parents is standing right next to him. By the way, he didn't even know his parents were murdered before this. And someone he considered his friend didn't tell him that even though he knew it. I think the blind rage here is understandable, at the very least. So Tony freaks out and tries to murder Bucky. Like, straight up murder. He tries to shoot a missile directly into his face, and this leads to a long, extended battle between him and Bucky and Cap, with the tides turning at multiple points throughout. Eventually, Tony is able to use his arc reactor repulsor blast to blast Bucky's metal arm off, and then beat down Cap using his superior technology. But then things are turned on him, and Cap starts beating the ever-loving crap out of him, but stops short of killing him, leaving him in a bloody, angry mess on the floor. As Bucky and Cap are leaving, Tony tells Cap that his father made that shield, so Cap leaves it behind for Tony, who now has to get himself home. Zemo was captured by Black Panther, who followed Tony there, by the way. Tony eventually gets back home, and one of his first orders of business is dropping Peter Parker back off in New York, which he does, and also lets him keep that epic high-tech suit he made for him, so Peter can keep superheroing in a more professional way, but still on a small scale. He tells him to tell Happy about what he does, which Happy will then tell Tony. Tony then gets back to Avengers HQ, where Rhodey is using some advanced tech to slowly allow him to walk again, although it's gonna be a long journey. Tony's like, well, this whole Avengers team thing isn't looking so good now, but he does get a package with a letter from Cap, along with a phone. The letter apologizing for Steve not telling him about his parents, and also saying, if you need me to save the world, just give me a call. Tony is then informed that Cap has freed his team from prison, and Ross wants to talk with him, but Tony just puts him on hold, letting Cap's team escape, because realistically, they're all good guys. And he also puts Ross on hold when Ross contacts him about finding where Natasha Romanoff is gone. After all this, Tony decides to take a bit of a break from superheroing again, focusing more on the usual billionaire stuff like attending big fancy parties and such, and in this time, he also gets back together with Pepper. Yay, love prevails. He also catches up with Spider-Man's activities from Happy, and while at a party in India, discovers that Peter has fallen into a lake and is about to drown, so he sends a suit to go save him, and then talks to him about what he's doing. Apparently, Peter's found some arms dealer who has some dangerous tech. Just don't get involved with it, kid. There are people who handle this stuff. Not Avengers level people, but people a little lower. You worry about stopping bike thieves and that kind of stuff. The arms dealer thing does seem a bit serious though, so Tony hands it off to the FBI, and after seeing Peter saving his class in Washington DC a few days later, calls him up to apologize for maybe being a bit harsh and congratulate him. But he realizes that Peter has royally screwed something up, so Tony dons the armor and sees that Peter has gone after the arms dealer, called the Vulture, himself. Exactly the opposite of what Tony asked, and in the process accidentally split a ferry down the middle. Whoops. Tony helps clean up the mess, but is pretty pissed off. He trusted and believed in Peter despite his age, and now he could have killed someone or gotten himself killed, which Tony wouldn't be able to live with, so he takes the Spidey suit that he made back so Peter can learn his lesson. However, a few days later, Tony sees that without the super suit, Peter actually stopped the Vulture from getting tons of tech from Avengers Tower, so he's like, alright, he seems to have learned his lesson, and has learned more of how to be a hero. Good kid, let's make him an official Avenger. When Tony offers Peter the gig, along with a new supersuit and a room at Avengers HQ, next to Vision, Peter turns it down because he wants to keep superheroing on a small scale, and Tony's like, damn, that's really humble and smart and responsible. Not used to that kind of attitude, but good on ya. So, to appease all the reporters he had gathered for the Spider-Man reveal press conference, Tony does something he's thought about doing for a while and proposes to Pepper. Yay. After this, that little pestering threat in the back of Tony's head of the end of the world via alien invasion is still lingering, so he starts working on his 50th suit of armor, the Mark 50, or Mark L, which uses super advanced nanotech, since without the Avengers assembled, it may end up being just him who has to defend the world. S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, or former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, I guess, Maria Hill, drops by at one point and is like, hey, call Steve Rogers up and work all this out. You two teaming up, and as a result, the Avengers coming back together could be useful if the world was attacked. Tony considers it, but ultimately doesn't do it. He's also told that Vision has disappeared and turned off his transponder. So that's great. Hopefully this one doesn't try to destroy the world. Tony's living the good, happy life with Pepper now, one night having a dream that they have a kid who they name Morgan after one of Pepper's uncles, and the next morning he's telling her about this dream. They're seemingly ready to properly settle down for a bit for a nice, peaceful life, maybe, when he is confronted by Dr. Stephen Strange, a sorcerer. Yes, those exist in this world too. Strange says he needs Tony's help. Tony's like, I'm good, this seems sketchy. But then Strange reveals he has Bruce Banner with him, who Tony hasn't seen in several years. So Tony decides to go along with him, and finds out that basically his worst nightmare is about to come true. Aliens aliens are coming to Earth with bad intentions, and not just any aliens, aliens from the same guy who sent aliens to New York back in 2012 that caused all of this anxiety for Tony. Loki was actually working with a big, angry space titan called Thanos back then, and now Thanos is back. He wants to collect all 6 Infinity Stones, super powerful objects, some of which Tony has encountered throughout his journey, they have the powers of the universe, and use them to snap half of all life in the universe out of existence. Not great news, especially considering Thanos already has 2 stones. One of the 4 remaining is with Doctor Strange, and another is with Vision. So they gotta get someone who can find Vision, and that guy is probably gonna be Steve Rogers. Tony's about to call Steve when he's interrupted by a giant alien ship landing in the street, with 2 of Thanos' minions demanding Doctor Strange hand over his Infinity Stone. The heroes refuse, and a battle ensues, with Tony suiting up with his new nanotech armor, and along the way, Spider-Man shows up to help out. Strange's friend Wong saves Tony's life, and is thus invited to his wedding. Strange is captured by the aliens, and is taken aboard the ship, which starts taking off, so Tony heads after it into space, deploying that fancy iron spider armor to save Peter's life, and also take him back down to Earth. Tony gets a call from Pepper, who is not happy about the situation, and is understandably worried about Tony, but the connection isn't great in space, and the call gets cut off. Tony finds Strange being tortured by the alien, and turns out Peter's stowed away on the ship, which Tony isn't crazy about, since Peter was just saying he was going to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and now is literally on the end of it all epic space mission, but Peter manages to convince him of why he should be there, and also, it's not like they have much choice now. They manage to free Strange with the help of more pop culture references, and while Strange wants to turn the ship back to Earth, Tony thinks it'd be a better idea to take it to Thanos' backyard and attack him on his home turf where he's not expecting it, which Strange eventually and begrudgingly agrees to, though he assures Tony he'll let him and Peter die for the sake of the Time Stone. Considering they're going on a space mission to fight Thanos, Tony decides to finally make Peter an official Avenger. They eventually get to the ship's destination, the planet of Titan, and kind of land the ship when they're attacked by various kinds of humanoid aliens, who turn out to be some space superheroes called the Guardians of the Galaxy. And after a brief scuffle over them not understanding that they have the same goal of stopping Thanos, they team up and try to make a plan for how they're going to do that. After discussing, they eventually settle on the plan to draw Thanos in, pin him down, get the Infinity Gauntlet. Everyone's happy. Doctor Strange also delivers the great news that they have a 1 in 14,605 chance of succeeding, so let's try not to mess this up. They wait until Thanos eventually does show up, and after a back and forth with Strange, the heroes jump on him, all using their powers to try to neutralize him. Tony uses his missiles and firearms and everything the suit can throw at Thanos, though he gets a bit thrown back at him as well, but eventually they do actually manage to hold Thanos down and are very close to getting the gauntlet off of him. However, one of the Guardians, Peter Quill, finds out his girlfriend and Thanos' daughter has been killed by Thanos. A lot of stuff that Tony doesn't really get the details of in the moment, but it's pretty apparent to everyone that Quill is upset. Tony tries to calm him down and restrain him, but it's too late. Quill gives Thanos a big whack in the face, and suddenly he's free, and he is pissed. In this pissedness, Thanos grabs a moon out of the sky with his Infinity Stones and hurls it at the heroes, which Tony manages to navigate, or at the very least, get through alive. Thanos incapacitates the other heroes, and eventually Tony is the only one still fighting, and he finally comes face to face with the being who essentially has haunted him for 6 years. Tony finds out that Thanos is actually familiar with him as well, and they go toe-to-toe with Tony throwing absolutely everything he's got left at him, only to get a drop of blood out of Thanos. Thanos kind of starts manhandling Tony and is beating him up pretty bad. It's not looking great, and eventually Thanos snaps off one of Tony's suit-made swords and stabs him right in the gut with it. Tony is now taken out of the fight, and as Thanos gets ready to kill him, he tells him he hopes the people who are left after half the universe is killed remember Tony. Before Tony is killed though, Strange goes back on that promise that he'd let Tony die for the Time Stone and hands it over to Thanos in order to spare Tony's life. Tony's not too grateful because this means Thanos is one step closer to winning, aka killing half the universe, and now all there's left to do for the heroes is to wait and hope the Avengers back on Earth have better luck against Thanos. Unfortunately, they do not, and Tony finds this out in a pretty brutal way. As a result of Thanos' snapping with all the Infinity Stones, half the living beings in the universe are killed via dusting, and slowly most of the heroes surrounding Tony start turning to dust. First the Guardians, besides Nebula, then Strange, and finally, to his horror, Peter Parker slowly starts disintegrating and whimpering, begging for his life, before he eventually disappears in Tony's arms. Side note, having not seen Infinity War in a while, really forgot how truly emotionally brutal this scene is. Now, Tony and Nebula are just stuck on this planet, way out in space, having to cope with the fact that they failed, the bad guy won, half the universe has been killed, and there's nothing they can really do, including anything about getting home, as although they manage to get the Guardian ship up and running and out into space, they run out of fuel and are just stalled there for a few weeks, with eventually the food and oxygen starting to run out. At least Tony and Nebula get to play some games and bond a little, but it's looking like this really is the end of the line. So Tony records a final goodbye message for Pepper. However, just as it seems like it's all over, Tony is woken up by a very bright light that turns out to be the superhero Captain Marvel, who is now working with the Avengers and who they had asked to go find and bring home Tony. She does just that, and a very tired and presumably hungry Tony Stark is brought back to Earth, where he's greeted by what's left of the Avengers, including Steve Rogers, and also Pepper, who Tony's very relieved to see is still alive. They head inside and start talking about strategy, how to find Thanos and fix what's been done. Tony's in a pretty bad emotional state, given he just saw someone he kind of viewed as a son die in his arms, in the process of failing to save the universe, and also he's been stuck in space for several weeks, so he lets out some of that pent-up emotion and starts going off a bit on Steve for not being with him to stop Thanos, saying this is what he feared for so many years, this is why he tried to build Ultron and keep the world safe, you should have shut up about those accords and just signed them, and together we could have stopped this and the world wouldn't be completely ruined now. He takes off his arc reactor, the new nanotech one, so it's not actually connected to his chest, as basically a big f*** you, and then from exhaustion passes out. When he wakes up, he finds out the Avengers actually found where Thanos was. Good news, they went there and killed him. Bad news, he had destroyed the Infinity Stones, and thus there was no way to reverse the damage that had been done with the snap. Tony's thought process now is, well, we lost. We failed. Tried to fix it, but we couldn't. So what do you do now? You move on with life. You keep going. And so that's what Tony does. While the rest of the Avengers try to keep protecting the universe, Tony decides to retire and properly settle down with Pepper. He gets himself a nice cabin out in the woods, probably builds it himself actually. He gets married to Pepper, and they have a daughter who they name Morgan. And over the next 5 years, Tony does just raise a family and live a very quiet life. And although for a while he's still haunted by the events that transpired with Thanos, probably never being able to mentally actually escape that, eventually he's able to accept it and find peace and acceptance and happiness in raising his daughter with Pepper. All of this is interrupted in the year 2023 when one peaceful day, Steve, Natasha, and Scott Lang show up at his cabin and tell him, hey, we have an idea for reversing the snap. And it's time travel. We travel back in time, grab the stones, and bring everyone back. Tony says, yeah, that's not gonna work. It's way too complicated and dangerous and, oh yeah, impossible. Besides, I've got my new family. I'm not risking all of this for something that has such a tiny chance of working. That chance being basically zero. But you guys can stay for lunch. However, later that night, Tony comes across an old photo of him and Peter, and along with the seed planted in his mind earlier that day about trying this time travel thing, he decides, hey, why not see if it could, maybe, hypothetically work? And what do you know? It totally can, which Tony is pretty surprised by. After he says goodnight to Morgan, who tells him she loves him 3000, he goes down to talk to Pepper about what he's found, and he's like, I can just put this away and never think about it again, and we'll just keep living our lives. And Pepper reminds him that not saving the universe when he's got a chance to is not in Tony's character. And if he knew he could do something but he didn't, would he ever truly be able to rest? And with that, Tony decides to help the Avengers with their time travel plan. He drives up to Avengers HQ, where the Avengers are unsuccessfully trying time travel without him. Trying time travel, that is a tough one. And he says, look at this, I solved your problem. I'm here to work with you guys. Tony and Steve finally make up after all the problems they've had, and to seal that friendship, Tony gives Steve back the shield. Now it's the team of Tony, Steve, Banner, who is now Smart Hulk, Thor, Natasha, Clint, who is now dumb haircut Clint, Rhodey, Scott, Nebula, and Rocket, a raccoon-looking alien who was with the Guardians. And they have to decide how they're going to pull off this so-called time heist. They decide to drop in at various points that they know from their own histories of where the stones have been, which includes New York in 2012, where 3 of them will be, Asgard in 2013, and 2 alien planets in 2014. But hey, Tony's going to go on the New York mission, because that's the one he's most familiar with, along with Steve, Hulk, and Scott. They do some tests, they do the research, and design special suits that will combine some of Hank Pym's, Scott Lang's friend and mentor, technology to help them travel in time, although they only have enough Pym particles to go to one place in time each and back again. Before they head off, Tony takes a few precautions if this doesn't work out, one being recording a little video message for his family and friends, with a nice little message from Morgan in there, and he also puts a program that controls lots of Stark Industries, weapons and drones and satellites in a pair of glasses, with him calling the program Even Dead I'm the Hero, or Edith. Which, if their plan is successful but he were to die, he wants Nick Fury to give to Peter Parker, as he trusts him to handle it, and it can help him, and hopefully nothing will go wrong with giving a kid access to an arsenal of high-tech weapons. Anyway, that's all done, it's time for the time heist. They suit up, Cap gives them a motivational speech about the importance of their mission, and then they shoot off in time with Tony's team going to New York 2012, and the time travel is successful. After they arrive, they all have their specific missions. Steve goes after the Scepter, Hulk gets the Time Stone, Tony and Scott get the Tesseract. Tony and Scott head up to Stark Tower, where the Battle of New York was wrapping up with the capture of Loki, and after commenting a little on America's ass, Tony gets Scott onto his past self near the Tesseract, and he gets himself a S.H.I.E.L.D. uniform as a disguise. As they head down to where there was a bit of a confrontation with Alexander Pierce, Tony orders Scott to crawl into his past self's arc reactor and give him a mild heart attack, which Scott does, and Tony uses the distraction to grab the Tesseract and get out of there. Psych! Hulk bursts through the door and sends the Tesseract flying to the feet of Loki, who takes it and teleports somewhere else in the world, probably to go on some adventure where he learns about love and the meaning of who he is and how time works in the universe and I don't know. Something like that. Anyway, this is bad news for 2023 Tony. They messed up the plan, and they only have enough pin particles to get home. They meet back with Rogers, who actually did get a stone, and tell him the bad news, but as they're arguing, Tony has a revelation that there's a point in time where they can get the Tesseract and enough pin particles to get them home, that being a S.H.I.E.L.D. base in New Jersey in 1970. So him and Steve head there while giving a confused Scott the scepter to take back to the future. Upon arriving, Tony goes to get the Tesseract while Steve gets the particles. Using future tech in the 70s, Tony gets it pretty easily, but then runs into a S.H.I.E.L.D. security guard, and oh my god, it's not a security guard, it's Tony's dad, Howard. Tony pulls himself together and starts talking with his dad, specifically about fatherhood, as Howard is about to become a father. To Tony. Tony, without letting on that he is his son from the future, talks about his own experiences raising his child and what he learned from his father, and also that his father taught him that no amount of money ever bought a second of time. With all this, Tony has not only gotten the Tesseract, but actually finally gotten the chance to make up and have closure that he'd never gotten with his father, and he gives a somewhat confused Howard a hug before heading back to meet Steve, who was also successful. With that, they travel back to 2023, everyone else also succeeded, and although Tony's feeling pretty good that the mission worked and he got to see his dad for one last time properly, the cheerful mood quickly evaporates as the team discovers that Natasha had to sacrifice herself for the mission to work. The team mourns her before continuing with the plan, including an epic bench throw from Hulk, but eventually they get back to the stones, with extra motivation to make sure Natasha's sacrifice was not in vain. Tony, Rocket, and Hulk build a gauntlet out of Tony's nanotech that can hold the stones, which goes off without a hitch. There's a bit of a discussion on who should wield the gauntlet, with Thor offering his services, though, and I haven't really mentioned it here, but ever since the snap, Thor went off the deep end a bit and has not been quite the same, and so the team thinks this probably wouldn't be the best idea. The task goes to Hulk, who is strong enough, hopefully, not to be killed by the power. Also, there are gamma rays involved, so Hulk it is. Hulk puts on the gauntlet, and although it's very tough, eventually is able to snap his fingers, reversing Thanos' actions and bringing every creature that was killed back to life. This is great news, obviously, but celebrations are cut short by a past version of Thanos arriving in 2023 who had followed them from 2014 because the nebulas were switched out. Long story short, Thanos is here to cause problems again, starting with destroying Avengers HQ. All the Avengers survive though, with Tony finding Cap's shield and giving it back to him, and they join Thor in confronting Thanos. Thanos has decided that this whole having the population thing clearly doesn't really work out, so he's just gonna destroy the whole universe and start from scratch. The three heroes then start battling Thanos, with Tony using Thor's lightning to power him up. Clearly that weapon on the suit design was inspired by some previous events. And although things are pretty back and forth, eventually Tony is incapacitated and knocked out while the other two are left to battle Thanos. When Tony comes to though, he sees something incredible. Hundreds of portals opening up and thousands of soldiers and heroes from across the universe coming to the aid of the Avengers to stop Thanos, which includes Peter Parker, and also Pepper shows up donning her own Iron Man suit. The heroes gather in front of Thanos' massive army, and right before they jump into battle, Cap summons Thor's hammer to him, which Tony thinks, that's new, before the words "Avengers Assemble" are said, and the battle begins. It's a crazy battle, with Tony at one point going back to back with Pepper to destroy Thanos' minions, and then being saved by none other than Peter Parker, who Tony is overjoyed to see and can't do anything but just give him a big hug. He also asks Doctor Strange if this is that one possibility they had of winning, and Strange is like, I can't tell you. The battle continues to be crazy. There's a bit of a hot potato situation going on with the gauntlet, trying to keep it out of Thanos' hands, or rather off of his hand. Captain Marvel shows up to help at one point, and then Tony has another little scuffle with Thanos, but is unsuccessful in stopping him, although he then sees Strange letting him know that this is in fact the one scenario, and he's gonna have to do something drastic and definitive. Tony understands and accepts his fate, and engages Thanos once again, who now has the gauntlet on, with Tony sneakily using his nanotech to steal the stones away from Thanos in the commotion. Thanos thinks he's won, and delivers another classic Thanos line, snaps, and to his dismay, nothing happens. He then sees in horror that Tony in fact has the stones, and you know the rest.
And I am Iron Man.
Tony snaps his fingers, and with that disintegrates Thanos and his entire army. Now, depending on what you count as canon, Tony's mind is also transported to a plane after the snap where he sees his daughter, but an older version, and they have a quick chat about what he's done and how he feels about it and that she's proud of him. But that isn't officially in the movie, so make of that what you will. Back in the real world, the energy from yielding the literal power of the universe in his hand has destroyed Tony's body, and he's on his way out, with Rhodey and Peter coming up to him and emotionally trying to say their goodbyes. Pepper comes up to Tony's body, and Tony uses the last energy he has left to say his final words, before Pepper tells him he can rest now. And with that, Tony Stark dies, having sacrificed his life to save the universe. Tony's legacy is honored with all the heroes kneeling, a big funeral being held for him, his family and friends listen to his recording. He leaves an incredible legacy behind. He evolved and grew over the years from a selfish, arrogant playboy billionaire to a selfless man, a father, and above all, a hero. And that is the end of Tony Stark's journey in the MCU. So, there you have it. Tony Stark's MCU journey, chronological order, one of the most iconic characters in modern pop culture, brought to life perfectly by RDJ. What do you think of his MCU journey? Is he your favorite MCU character? Which movie of his or appearance of his was your favorite? And do you think we'll ever see him again properly? Like not in What If or something like that, but a proper MCU movie appearance. Personally, I hope not. I think they wrapped it up pretty perfectly, but you never know. Anyway, let me know all of your thoughts down below in the comments. While you're at it, be sure to like this video, check out my Instagram and Twitter at BHL_Hudson, my TikTok at BHLHudson, check out this podcast that I do with a friend of mine where we talk about movies, TV shows, a bunch of nonsense. It's called the Poorly Planned Podcast, and subscribe for more videos like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.